Good afternoon. This is Professor Amina Al-Din with Critical Talk. And I am just so fortunate, I'm beside myself, to have as my guest Dr. Mohammed Fraser Rahim. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Intelligence and Security Studies at the Citadel, which is in Charleston, South Carolina. In addition, he is the executive director, North America for Quillam International, the world's oldest counter extremist organization with headquarters in the United Kingdom and offices in Washington, D.C., where he oversees policy. He is an expert on violent extremism issues, both domestically and overseas. And prior to his current role, he served as a senior program officer at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where he leads their whole horn of American programs and served as an expert on preventing and countering violent extremism. Um, Issues at the Institute. In addition, Dr. Rahim worked for the United States government for more than a decade for the Department of Homeland Security. He was the director of national intelligence at National Counterterrorism Center. You got too much here for a bio, so I'm gonna have to work that in later. I am just privileged to have known you over the years, and had I known you made real money, I would have known you better. But since now I am reconnected, I am reconnecting over, and I'm going to hold it up for our audience, this book, America's Other Muslims, Imam Muhammad Muhammad, Islamic Reform, and the Making of American Islam. And it's a very important book, which I have reviewed, much to my satisfaction. I'm waiting for book number two, but I want to get into the book because there are some things that are pivotal. They are critical. And let me just give you a little itsy bitty synopsis. We still, in the 21st century, in the second decade of the 21st century, we still have two quite separate groups of Muslims in the United States. Well, maybe there's a third. There's some who kind of mill over between the two. I'm not sure, however, how they exchange ideas, etc. But one thing that is for certain is beyond the kind of nation foundation of there being something called Islamic words being spoken, the presence of a Quran, whether we're talking about slave communities or what Thomas Jefferson owned. Um, there was in the beginning of the 20th century. I'm not good with this century thing. Um, the formation, which you in this text call foundational. And that is very important because there's a master narrative floating about these knucklehead African Americans running around with a piece of this, piece of that, piece of the other. But when you see them again in an historical perspective, you can see some other things evolving. So you want to talk a little bit about how you came upon the notion of seeing more science temple, all of these places as foundational.
Yeah, thank you so much, and it's an honor really to be interviewed by you because I always credit the late Dr. Suleiman Yang, who I studied under, and who I first met when I was in Charleston, South Carolina, growing up. And I remember reading your book and remember being inspired of seeing this woman who is at DePaul and being excited. So I have to really thank you for really allowing to setting the stage for all of us. And everything else we're doing is just building off of the excellent legacy that you have established. So thank you.
Oh,
So the way I like to frame this, and this text is, I think, an important one because what it frames is this conversation of one connecting in the broader book, connecting the legacy of Islamic thought, and if I dare, I should say African Islamic thought in Africa, right? And I think that that's important because oftentimes, and I quote this in my book, that, you know, the late Sheikh Amadou, who a well-known Islamic intellectual thinker in West Africa, well-known just as much as we quote our great heroes who come before, he said, "I no longer need Baghdad nor Fez. Upon seeing Jollof, I submitted."
Yeah.
And I think that that's really exciting and important because here we have a West African Muslim who's able to study in those distant places of learning, and particularly in the modern era,
Right.
many of us who studied abroad in the Middle East and being excited and passionate. But this individual also saying, when I came back to my own backyard, in this case, Jollof is in West Africa, I was able to submit because he was able to recognize the legitimacy, the deep level of Islamic knowledge on their own terms and not compromising that as well.
Right.
So I only bring that connection to West Africa, not in a romanticized view, because I think, to be very open and candid, I think there's also a romanticized view of what we think Islam and Africa, whether it's true or not. And I think that that has to be fleshed out in a really interesting, nuanced fashion. But when we look at these, oftentimes we use Islamic proto movements. I like using the term Islamic hybrid movements.
Okay.
Because I think this hybridity also shows this level of proto seems in some way that they were outside the form
Right.
of Islam.
It's a bastardization.
Bastardization. And I think this hybridity is the same way Islam spread, as we talked about prior, into Java, Islam spreading into South Asia, etc. And I think that these Islamic hybrid movements were just as important for the social reform movement that we see African Americans journey into Islam. Mm-hmm. And I think that this is important to recognize them for their own terms in light of the social, political environment of living in America. And so there would be no Islam, what we know normative Islam, without these Islamic hybrid movements. There would be no Islam in modern day institutions without like movements like the Ahmadiyya movement. Right. That oftentimes gets hijacked in the sense of a South Asian framework of their state view of how this is. That's oftentimes very much a geopolitical dynamic more than anything. So, you know, I think that this is certainly an important thing to highlight, and it's certainly something that I think that's taking place that we see in the broader in the broader Muslim world. But I think these Islamic hybrid movements are important as we think about the spread of Islam. And one of the last thing I think that I'll highlight in this is, I think our American Muslim communities in the United States need to go back to the same way young people learn religion and history throughout the world. They have to, the late Imam Waqti Muhammad, and I have walls of his works and literature, and I have Arabic texts too as well. And I've always worked to try to look at his context in the classical tradition, but also in his context on his own. But one of the things he said is, you have to look at the rise and fall of Islamic civilization.
Yeah.
Understand your place in Islamic history, and also understand your own story and narrative. American Muslims, all of them, regardless of their ethnicity and ideological persuasion, have to go back to the basics, and they have to understand a balanced approach of what Islam and how it arrived in the United States. It's the same way that I would receive when I studied abroad in West Africa as a college student in Senegal. I would be taught how Islam arrived in Senegal. Right. Or if I was in Bangladesh or in Maldives. And I think the same way American Muslims should be understanding that context, not just Malcolm as some revolutionary or Muhammad Ali as this individual who transitioned, but in a broader context as well. So I think that's something important to me.
Well, it is Islamic history that many have tried to do something with. I'm not sure what they think they're doing, but the settling of Islam as a faith tradition in societies across the globe has always had a settling, you know. I mean, it doesn't dump everything that's in the community where it arrives. You know, it makes, and you're calling it hybrid. I'll have to work with that. um, because I don't know that there is something we can call the Muslim experience or appropriation or establishment of Islam. You know, I don't know where that norm is.
Mhm.
And one of the books you and I talked about earlier was Shahid Ahmed's What is Islam? You know, and
Mhm.
Islam, I mean, Muslims are, of course, many, many things. And because Muslims are many, many things, Islam, not to get into Islamisms and Islams with an S or any of those things, but it's whose norm?
Mhm.
Where?
Mhm.
Um, what would there is no Orthodox Church, although I'm sure Muslims would love for there to be. But
Mhm.
fortunately, as of yet, there isn't one, even though that's what's being pushed here. So here in early 20th century America, we have the establishment, and I think this is where American history becomes um, important. You know, if you didn't have Benjamin Franklin and all of those old dudes involved in the Barbary Wars,
Mhm.
a lot of the then what comes up in Christian missionary stuff about Islam and some other things from the north coast of Africa wouldn't have been there, right?
Yeah.
So, and then when you have, I am so bad with dates, 18, it's killing me, 20 something or the other. Um, the Morocco recognizing the nation United States as a country.
1776. Yeah.
Huh?
1776.
Mm, whatever.
American.
I have to go with your days because, you
Mhm.
know, what can I say? I'm so young, I don't
Yeah.
remember.
Mhm.
Um, you have inside of those treaties, which is still online for our viewers and listeners, uh, the Moroccans say they don't want their people enslaved as they're coming here as diplomats and others.
Mhm.
So that there is no Islamic interaction because people are always interacting. These people are all over the place. People see them. They see that they're people of color. The whole nine yards is actually happening.
Yeah.
So when you said foundational, I said that's it. I mean that works out so perfectly. Because
Yeah.
yeah, go
And
ahead.
I was just building off of what you're saying. I mean, listen, there was the broader world had always had a fascination of what Islam was or wasn't. I mean, the French philosopher Voltaire was was an observer of Islam as well.
Right.
And there was a play called Muhammad the Prophet
Yeah.
in French,
Yeah.
and obviously, or Muhammad the Imposter, I should
Yeah.
say.
Yeah.
And so there was clearly some, it's like someone observing someone from a distance. They might not like them, but they're at least studying for who they are and
Mhm.
these caricatures and these depictions. And it's interesting in Baltimore, October 1st and October 15th, um, 1852, there was two showings of Muhammad the Prophet.
Mm.
And this is a quite interesting idea that, the fact that this showing was of the depiction of the Prophet Muhammad. It wasn't in the most flattering ways, as you can imagine,
Of
but
course.
it
Yeah.
was a depiction of the Prophet because they recognized that they were having interaction with the Islamic world. And
Yeah.
I think that this is important too, as well, is that we only, and oftentimes our communities study just Islamic history. We have to do a much better job of studying this in holistic fashion. Like our Catholic brothers, historically speaking, though things have shifted quite a bit from their form of education, but just in terms of how they encourage arithmetic and logic and grammar.
Right.
And clearly we've seen
Well,
this.
that left Islamic studies,
Yeah.
and people in their bids to control Islamic studies have, pushed it to the wayside. Studying Islamic history is not a global endeavor. You know,
Yeah.
it's a It depends upon who you are, endeavor. And therefore, we have over a billion ignorant people about Islam in the world. But in our communities, one of the things you read, and I'm not remembering the African American writers who write about them, is they're talking about the Moore Science Temple and how when people are hiring people off the street to do day labor and this and that and the other, the best person to hire is a Moore. Honest, trustworthy, gonna be on time, gonna get the job done.
Absolutely.
One set of stuff, but then on the other set of stuff, these Moorish science Americans are faced with all of the kind of leftovers from slavery.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the I want to pull you into the gambling, the drinking, the this,
Mm-hmm.
the that, the other. So they're building a reputation for who they want to be with a faith kind of like undergirding
Mm-hmm.
and fighting off the hmm, all of the stuff that's out there that wants to pull them in a different way. They don't, however, see people seem to, and I don't know who I was reading. They seem to know they're there. Writers are writing about them, you know, in kind of abstract.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, they don't seem to be threatening anything or the other. They're there. They're perhaps sometimes on a milk carton. Other times you see them passing through the street.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that's why I love this thing of foundational.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that it's this idea, you know, and foundational, and even I think this play on. I mean, I've seen some interesting pushback on how we describe foundational, indigenous, and then certainly we probably need to rethink how we describe quote unquote immigrant Muslim communities, right? Because clearly there's been pushback in light of the anti-immigration policies that have certainly been perpetuated by the current administration, and
Mm,
how that, you know, some might feel that that plays into a broader trope.
yeah.
But you know, and so as academicians, is playing with these terms, right? Hybrid right now is what I'm using for to describe these African American Muslim communities,
Right.
but perhaps there'll be another framing of how we define that. But I think that that evolution is what's taking place, and and quite frankly too as well as, I mean, there has been a slow shifting and demographic shift of what we know what it means to be Muslim, right?
Say
In the
more.
20th
Say
century.
more. Say more. I'm not
Yeah.
letting you get away with that. Say more.
So what is it? What is it now? You know, in terms of how we describe what it means to be Muslim in the current era, because you know, individuals' first interaction with Muslims, we're talking about the 20th century, and then we can move forward. You know, their familiarity was with Moors. Their familiarity were with individuals who were members of the nation, or the Dar movement, or you know, pick your, you know, X, Y, and Z African American movement that's been out there. And so I think it's quite interesting to see um, the language, the lexicon, the imagery that is slowly shifting. And then, as you know, many have written on this slow Black erasure. I mean, Chan Malik's book has been a wonderful body of analysis looking at, you know, a woman in their role. And I think that, an incredible body of work. And I saw that you previously had Suad Abdul Kabir too as well on, and her body of work contributing, pushing these conversations too as well. And I think they all add up to what it means to be Muslim in America, but also what it means to be an African American Muslim now is shifting, on top of Pew Gallup data that's showing a steady decline of people going and inclined toward religiosity. And we have to also factor that in within our African American Muslim communities. You know, perhaps that's a book down the line of how that plays out.
Well, say a little bit more about your thoughts on that issue right now.
Well, I mean, I think this is something I've been exploring. Perhaps there's a journal article on that, but I think that there is, and, you know, I look at peers, and I look at Muslim communities throughout the United States and African American Muslim communities. The way Islam is practiced now is varied in so many ways. Like the charisma of the Nation of Islam and those Islamic hybrid movements, the charisma of Imam Warfti Muhammad. Many of these communities are also very much affected by an aging community.
Mm-hmm.
And as those communities age out, the message, the delivery, the packaging, the presentation, is it able to adjust? Is it shifting? I mean, you can look at various messages throughout the United States, and you look at individuals who congregate there on an everyday basis. I mean, who would have thought we would be talking about unmosques, right? People who are online and they get their Friday khutbahs. Who would have thought that we would be talking about third spaces?
Right.
Because people are not comfortable in various messages throughout the United States. And so I think that this is pushing individuals to offer those other ways. I think, unfortunately, internet and technology and the ability to Google everything has also made individuals to be a scholar overnight. So many of these, I know, so many of these fatwas that are issued, these positions that are offered, would historically in the Islamic tradition be discussed privately, right, among scholars, because they're very technical on matters of aqidah and fiqh and sharia, etc. But now anyone can offer an opinion, and so I think that that's an interesting phenomenon in the West that is it has to be flushed out, because I'm not so inclined to say that it needs to be the old world needs to be revisited and brought here. That's not the interest of my research per se. But I think that in the United States, there has to be an interesting balance of what's going to be created. And I think in the next 5 years, it will be nothing like what we've seen in the 20th century,
I would agree.
The early 20th century, I should say.
Yeah. I think that there is a big tug of war as we have in African Muslim America, reassessing. There's some resistance, but a reassessing of how people have been taught to think about their own historical evolution.
Mm-hmm.
If you call somebody pseudo and this and that and the other, what
Mm-hmm.
happens is then you have an illegitimate history.
Yeah.
And although that master narrative has been pushed for at least 40 years that I know of, many of you are now saying, I don't think so.
Yeah.
Let's look again. How do you get a people come migrating from the south to the north who don't even know how to live by themselves uncontrolled
Mm-hmm.
into doing some things, and at the same time learning that there is nobody back there controlling you, but also unlearning what you have learned. And I think that the more Science Temple and Nation of Islam were adept at that, which is why I wrote of Elijah Muhammad as an American philosopher, which
Absolutely.
got me a bunch of hell, but that's a different issue. But then when you look at the Ahmadi, the issues on the Indian subcontinent, and I hate that it's called the subcontinent too, but are different in their trying to, after the British ran them over, to get to this is Islam. Unequivocally, this is Islam. This is how we're going to do it, etc. Very different set of stuff when you come to a different land. Now, it didn't stop what had already been infused or heightened with regard to Indian racism, right? Because the Ahmadi never let an African American rise to be the sheikh. I met one man who was on his way, and I think he was a sheikh for a hot minute, and they snatched him away. But because of the strictures and the racism, little things that were organic portions of African America, jazz, other music, poetry, etc., were immediately given the taboo sign, and many early jazz musicians who had embraced Islam had to walk away.
You know, my uncle, who he's still alive. He's the oldest living surviving member of Count Basie Jazz Orchestra, and he's
The what?
Muslim. He's the oldest living surviving member of Count Basie Jazz Orchestra,
Ah,
and his name is John Williams, and he is in Orangeburg, South Carolina, right now, 84, 3-ish. You know, black people sometimes we don't tell our
is
age,
his
but
faculty all there?
I'm sorry.
Are his faculties all there?
Yeah, his faculty, he's you know he's getting older, so he's
Yeah.
going through things. But what I'm doing, and on another project, I'm documenting his story and his life. So there's a lot. That's another project that I think you all will find
That's
pretty interesting.
awesome.
But his conversion also, I mean, he interacted with McCoy Tyner. He was interacting
I
with
know. I knew
Yusuf
McCoy
Lateef. He was
Tyner.
interacting with all these individuals who were Ahmadi, but he did not become Ahmadi.
Right.
He was Sunni Muslim, if you will, right? He was just Muslim, and it's interesting, right, that you have these mass movements of Muslims who converted, many who were artists, but you have others who quietly were just living a life of Islam, whose
Right.
anecdotal stories we can piece together that offer a glimpse of what it means at a very spiritual level, at a
But
political
see,
level.
I'm glad you hit there because that's what's missing. There,
That's what you think.
immigrants have brought a very sterile Islam,
Mm,
although they live a very rich interior.
mm.
But African Americans have been imposed upon with this sterile Islam and asked to get rid of a very rich interior.
And you know the great rich tradition of our, you know, as a product of the South, that rich tradition of Southern values, right, or Gullah Geechee values, were
Mhm.
instilled on me on as my parents and community were teaching me the Quran, right? I had that community and village as I was memorizing Quran as a young child in
Oh,
Warsh Shabbat.
yeah,
And I remember and I say this all the time, my father always encouraged, he says, you know, when you study abroad, extract the knowledge, but do not become someone else.
exactly.
And I think that that's a really telling. It's the mastery of getting the technical knowledge of Islam, but coming back home if you have to go there. I think now we can get. I mean, many of the rich Islamic studies sources are all in the West now,
Right.
which is so interesting. Which is another conversation. But it's a very telling for our young people who aspire for this distant land. That this idea of the Islamic world as there's a wonderful book by a Turkish writer called The Idea of the Muslim World. Came out about 3 years ago.
I know
And
him. Simil.
yeah, yeah, Jamal, yeah. So
Yeah.
and I think it's an idea, right, that we have, and particularly our young, our African American Muslim communities throughout urban populations. It is this romanticized view of the Muslim world that has some of the same challenges and issues that we see throughout the world,
Exactly.
including in the West.
Because
And
clearly, uh, Muslim living over there is nowhere near an ideal. The
yeah, absolutely.
countries are not thriving. They're not healthy. They've devolved into violences of all sort. The violence against women is unreasonable, um, and I have to admit, many here uh, uh, just go up in arms. Please don't bring that here. Keep it over there. You know,
Yeah.
don't bring that here. Just keep it over there.
I think American Muslims have to be comfortable, right? And I think in getting back to the book, I think American Muslims, Imam Muhammad was a man ahead of his time because, as you know very well, when he was promoting interfaith dialogue, the
Mhm.
amount of pushback he received, uh, there should I say, almost being labeled as a munafiq, as a on borderline committing. I mean, all the different labels. I don't even want to bring up, but it's so interesting that now what seems normal to engage with our broader humanity, right? Humankind was the norm. I mean, Craig, right? Creating racial images of the divine. This is a huge campaign and effort that was promoted. So I just bring, Imam Muhammad up just to frame in this concept of these ideas and principles that, just like broader African American culture, have been the leaders, right, pushing for reform, even within the Islamic tradition, individuals like the nation, etc., in their hybridity and the leadership and the legacy of the late Imam Warsi Muhammad have been advocating for an independent way of thinking, recognizing the rich tradition of Islam, but saying, guess what? Whether you're not comfortable calling it a school of thought,
Right.
it's at least a methodology that's being structured in the West and in America in particular.
But I think that is critical because so many of us um, have all these people of different faiths in our families.
Yeah.
A homogenous Muslim coming from a homogenous Muslim world has none of it and doesn't really know and knows that somewhere deep down inside that they don't really know how to have a conversation because they're not clear on how to have the current conversation.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to pivot back to some stuff. And one of them is the idea of the Muslim world that you mentioned. And what is Islam? Because I see, just reading between the lines, that your thoughts were sparked by those two texts.
Mm-hmm.
So you want to say a word or two or three or four?
Yeah, I think I'm a student. My doctoral work is in history, and so I'm a historian by training. Though I've professionally been working in the policy world, I've always found a way to synergize the two. And I think when I think of Shahab Ahmed's work, I think about also Fazlur Rahman. I think about a whole breadth of individuals who have challenged us to really step back of how we envision what Islam is or isn't. Is it the Islam of taste, right? Whether in studying throughout West Africa or in Egypt, etc. Is it the Islam of lived experience? Is it the Islam of books? And
Yeah.
I think some historians have wrestled with this, right? What Khaldun wrestled with this, right? Trying to explain what Islam is or isn't. And I think what Shahid Ahmed's book does and what is Islam, I remember the opening line, and for many this would offend. I remember people were critiquing him on it, but I remember the opening line of this. He opens up and says that he was sitting down next to someone, and a colleague of his was having a glass of wine, and the guy, the opening, it read like a novel, and so the guy asked him, says, why are you drinking this wine? Muslims don't do this, and the guy responds back, well, my father did that, my grandfather, generations had done that. And I thought it was interesting. On surface, for those who are, very legalistic, it would be like, oh, what is he talking about? But I think he was trying to offer an analogy to say that people have inherited traditions, and sometimes they don't know why they do what they do. And secondly, they engage in activities that might be rooted in Islam, but also they might be rooted in customs and traditions that are part of their culture. And as we know, look at Pashtun Wali is more conservative. The moral ethical code practice in Afghanistan is more conservative than Islamic Sharia, which which can be interpreted in so many ways. But it's interesting how you have this sort of moral ethical code, and then you look at the Wolof that have a moral and ethical code in West Africa, or you get my point. And so I think that these are wonderful gems for American Muslims, African American Muslims, to build off of, learn of, to normalize their Islam on their own terms, right? And so that when you come to any masjid in area, it's say you should, did you have a bean pie? Because that's part of the experience just as much as you've had baklava.
I just had bean pie the other night. Can you set up just a little bit? I'm just going to ask you to set up a little bit because you're going to slide off my screen.
Sorry. So, I think that
too comfortable.
I got too comfortable. So, no. So I think that this is important because I think what American Muslims are, there's a lot of technical knowledge that's being given, but there's less practical knowledge being given of how do you apply this Islam on an everyday basis, right? And so, and I think that this is where we are in this critical juncture right now, in American history and global history too as well. So, Shahab Ahmed's work was, it inspired me, and many other books that have been out there. But I think that what this offers is a gem, what it offered to me was for American Muslims and Western Muslims more broadly, to really come up with a framework for success for the present and for the foreseeable future, and how they see their vision of Muslim life in their own societies, right? And I think that that's an important one that's not rooted in, a village interpretation of Islam. And I say that with no disrespect, but that village interpretation of Islam has given us FGM. That village interpretation of Islam has given us honor killings. That village interpretation has given us religious minorities who aren't protected. And so what it looks as though is that the real influence and contribution is from the West. Right. And that Muslims have in some way lost the battle, if you will. And I think that it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. I think it can be one in which we have to really invest in our next generation to be part of a global world that is time, space relevant.
I agree. I'm going to just shift a little bit. Having not been a part of Warthi's community, gave me an opportunity to really sit back and watch. Mm-hmm. And having met him gave me an opportunity to ask very pointed questions. Mm-hmm. But what I saw was, there's this again, I'm loving my master narrative trope. This master narrative that had nothing to do with what was actually going on. From what I saw, the Imam was hell-bent on there being an American Islamic experience that was informed by some things, but not overtaken by them. And toward that end, what he still realized he had to do was some of the foundational work that his dad had done had to stay. But then there had to be some, okay, you're a teenager now or you're a young adult now and you need to grow up and do some young adult things. Sending people overseas to study, not so that they become someone else, but so that they build a base of familiarity, right? Some people always in any religious community are going to try to resist, and they resist in all kinds of ways. All of that is normal. But I think that is the story that you begin to tell in this text. You're clear with us that I need more sources. All of us have been trying to get more sources, and I wish people would stop sitting on sources and get up off of them. But we're people who has been so suppressed and oppressed that giving over anything means that somebody who's not of you makes a fortune off you. So people tend to hoard, even they'll die hoarding it. I'd rather see it go up in flames. But I think that as you build what I think is an awesome framework in this text, and we get to the 20th century, and Imam Warthi is fighting off the FBI and their stuff. He's fighting off other African American Muslims who, led by immigrants, have to decide whether he's Muslim at all. Then he's fighting the people in the community who quite humanly are resisting change, right? And then trying to grow a new generation of scholars with the right set of values.
Yeah. You really you captured it perfectly. And I think that, it's interesting. The internal conversation was one, and that I think oftentimes is not, it's uncomfortable, right? Because I've listened to people you're trying to push them, and then you ask them, and they're like, everything's all rosy and perfect. But Imam Muhammad, he left the community or resigned from his role, right. Because he recognized individuals were not stepping up to the level that he was expecting. And so those individuals who studied abroad, first in Malaysia as part of that formal program, and then certainly in Damascus, Syria, for individuals, trying to give them the religious literacy to then be able to come back. And so we see products of that in, Atlanta being one, the Atlanta National Valley Islam having individuals and imams who were trained in classical Islamic tradition. And I think that that's part of it, right? But Imam Muhammad also was saying, hey, get that. I'm trying to push you all.
Absolutely.
You're not going to necessarily, you aren't listening. And then also some of you all just want a replica of my father, and
Right.
you just want regurgitated information that's said, and you just like how I sound, but it requires you to do the deep work, right? So I think it's an interesting balance of where does the community go next? Secondly, how can these gems be developed to help a broader African American Muslim narrative that will bring in Sufi Muslims and Shia Muslims, right? We have contingency of African American Shias, of Ahmadi, of Muslims who just probably are secular, who only come just for Eid and during Ramadan. I mean, those are all part of that melu that is part of an Islamic society that represents the same way that you would see in the Umayyad or the Abbasid or the Seljuk Empire, of different Muslim expression, but they're part of the Muslim life. And I think that's important, that what Imam Muhammad was trying to encourage is this diversity, but training individuals to be qualified to be able to lead, right? And the pandemic is a perfect example. Many individuals, their ability to be able to, are they able to lead? And, the deep, the basics for Islam, these things are, being unpacked. And I think, I've heard individuals who are, this is putting much more pressure. And I think it's kind of like a eureka moment of what Imam Muhammad was encouraging, saying, hey, you have to be prepared yourself, so.
They know nothing about our West African ancestors, but everything about the Arab world. We're saying, hey, we're here. Thank you very much. But that's what is taught. I'm going to just say this real quick. Starting today, and I'm going to prevail upon you. My husband's family lived on West Congress Street, right around the corner from Citadel. But we're going to start a book club.
Okay.
A once a month book club. And I'm going to ask you, with a Muslimah, to lead the book on white fragility.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah. Really good text.
That's my one thing. So everybody listening out there, go buy the book. Muhammad and Donna are going to lead us in a wonderful discussion, probably August, the first week in August. And since you all are not going out partying, I know you'll be available. Number two, I'm going to give you the last 2-3 minutes. What do you want to leave us with? Because I'm also going to put you in some other kind of context as we talk about Islamophobia and some other things, which is also in your realm of expertise.
Yeah.
So what do you want to leave us with?
Well, what I would leave you with is, American Muslims are on the move. Yeah. And I think I'm particularly as an African American Muslim who was trained and cultivated in a rich tradition, I think we have to continue to replicate the best thereof of our tradition. And we cannot erase those wonderful legacy of Ralph Ellison. We cannot dismiss the wonderful legacy of Audre Lorde. We cannot dismiss the wonderful legacy of great African American W.E.B. Du Bois, et cetera. Right. And those rich traditions have to be celebrated on top of our Islamic tradition as well. Exactly. And I think that content. Yes. Yep. And those have to be celebrated and highlighted. And I think that those should be required readings, not just for African American communities, but also for our African American Muslim communities, but for our broader Muslim communities as well. And Carter G. Woodson's work of Miseducation of the Negro could also be applied for miseducation of the Muslim, and understanding and understanding.
We will write that book.
We will write that book. So I'll leave you with that, and that's that's my little final parting words.
I am so tickled. I don't know what to do. Seeing you, I know I've seen you when you were a pup.
Mm-hmm. I have a quarantine. I have a quarantine beard too. This is a quarantine beard.
Okay. This is Professor Amin Al-Din, and this has been Critical Talk with Dr. Muhammad Fraser Rahim, who will come back and join us in a number of different capacities shortly.